All right. So hello, everyone in the room and who's watching from around the world. I'm Matthew Cavanaugh. From Georgetown University. I direct the Global Health Policy and Politics Center at Georgetown University and the UNAIDS Collaborating Center on HIV inequality policy. We are here today because around the world, we have seen pandemics taking more and more lives. Around the world, 40 million people died of HIV due to the HIV pandemic. And right now, we have seen, though, remarkable success. Despite having no cure and no vaccine, we have seen remarkable success in the AIDS response, in which 30 million people are currently on HIV treatment. That's 3/4 of people in the world, which is remarkable. And yet we see highly unequal progress. The progress has been incredible for some, and we have other communities who have seen little or no progress. And that is what is continuing the AIDS pandemic. And it's also what's continuing the COVID pandemic of today. And in addition to HIV, and in addition to COVID, we've seen pandemics of Ebola and Zika and Mpox and COVID-19. We are in an era of pandemics. And it is not an accident that that era of pandemics is also the era in which we've seen remarkable inequality, that income and wealth inequality is at levels that have not been seen before, close to the peak levels of the 20th century. Meanwhile, you see deep inequality on gender, ethnic, sexuality, and geography factors. And so as we think about that, what we see is that inequality is driving pandemics, both inequality within countries and inequality between countries. And for that reason, we have established the Global Council on Pandemics, AIDS, and Inequality. It's actually the Global Council on Inequality, AIDS, and Pandemics. See, I got it wrong already, and it's literally sitting behind me. And we have here today an august panel who will think about that. Members of that council who are going to give us their thoughts. On your seats are 3 of the first products of that Global Council, I invite you to take a look at them. One is a new paper led by John Ataguba, a member of the council, and the head of the African Health Economics Association, that shows that inequality and pandemics are connected empirically. I want to start with a keynote conversation from the Right Honorable Helen Clark, who is former Prime Minister of New Zealand and head of the Independent Panel and former head of UNDP and many, many things. But mostly we asked her to be on the council because she is someone who knows how to tell truth to power, to analyze the context that we are in, and to drive us toward actions that might actually close those inequalities and make the world less vulnerable. So Helen, over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Matthew, and good afternoon, everyone. This is a bit of a hit and run for me because I have a lunch table of women leaders in another dining room waiting for me to come and moderate a conversation. But firstly, really thrilled to be supporting the Council on Inequalities, AIDS and Pandemics for 2 reasons. One, I can't say no to Winnie, my old friend and colleague, but secondly, the cause is great. And Winnie is so right that this SDG 10 on inequalities is one of the ones that's had the least attention. And yet, as was said in the very opening remarks today, inequalities are the defining issue of our times. And the issue is, will our world be bold enough to address this, or will it keep looking the other way? And when I was thinking about the consequences of looking the other way, I thought about that lyric from Les Miserables, which said, "Do you hear the people singing the song of angry men? It's the music of the people who will not be slaves again." Let's take that as a rallying cry for the work of this council and pushing forward on SDG 10. Inequalities blight our societies, and of course they have very particular implications for health. The HIV pandemic was and still is exacerbated by inequalities, by discrimination against LGBTQI+, discrimination against sex workers, discrimination against people who use drugs, all these key populations who have been so hard to reach if marginalized and stigmatized. It's the HIV pandemic also exacerbated by gender inequality. And think of the particular vulnerability today of adolescent girls. Again, a fast rising rate of HIV. Marginalization in general, those whose services don't reach, inequalities mar service access, inequality of access to therapeutics. And let's remember, we've never had a full TRIPS waiver for antiretrovirals. We had a kind of declaration out of Doha way back in 2001, but never had a proper TRIPS waiver. So fast forward now to this pandemic, the COVID-19 one, all the inequalities that characterize the response between countries. And we know the story that high income countries hogged the vaccines. The injustice revealed in the pricing around vaccines. I want to acknowledge Fatima from South Africa and the incredible work done to bring out into the open what South Africa was paying for vaccines, paying more than high income countries. How can this possibly happen? The injustice, of course, we saw with COVAX Act A, which was trying to supply vaccines at market prices with charitable funding. That was never going to add up. This response just doesn't work. And can I say that equity in pandemic response demands a new end-to-end ecosystem. It has to start with a commitment to investment in research and development across the world's developing regions. It needs support for manufacturing, and it needs support for surge funding when the worst happens, and you have to scale up very fast with the essential vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, medical oxygen, you name it, the things we need to fight. So inequalities blight health, they exacerbate pandemics. What we have seen is tremendous profit from those who develop the technologies required to fight pandemics, but we have seen gross inequity in the distribution. And I think it's a strong feeling about how unjust this is that drives us to support initiatives like this new council, and to say that, if we don't get this right, we're in for a pretty rough ride in our world, because people aren't going to accept the injustice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. And we really appreciate that. I would encourage everyone, you can find the full council online. We've got a website up. It's at inequalitycouncil.org. And you can see the august folks who have joined this council to do two things. One, to identify how are these mechanisms working. We have research that shows that in higher inequality contexts, pandemics are more problematic. Governments are less successful at responding to them. But why? What's going on there? How do we understand that? Because if we can understand that cycle, then we can identify what are the policies and the programs that might interrupt that. And we can design ways to do so. And so we have a mix of academics, civil society leaders, government officials, arts leaders who have come together to think about this core question, to help us understand it and to help us tackle it as we go forward. And so with that, I'm going to call up to the stage our fantastic panel of speakers. And so you've heard from one of the council members, Helen Clark. The council is co-chaired by three amazing leaders, one of whom is Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate and professor at Columbia University. And so if you would come on up, thank you. The other two of our co-chairs are not with us today, but it's First Lady Monica Gingos of Namibia and Professor Michael Marmot of the UCL Institute for Inequalities in Health. And these are amazing leaders. We have an economist, we have an epidemiologist, and we have a political leader. And that is truly remarkable. The other members of our panel today that I will call up, Vice Minister Ethel Maciel, who will come up and please join us from Brazil. She is the Secretary of Surveillance and a longtime leader in health, especially on tuberculosis and deep inequalities. And so we're thrilled to have her with us as well. Biens Goanas, if I can ask you to come up, who is Vice Chair of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, and who we're really thrilled to have with us. Dr. Jérôme Salaman, who is the Assistant Director General of the World Health Organization for UHC, communicable and non-communicable diseases, who every time I say his title, I think to myself, what is not in his remit? And I'm having trouble coming up with things. And finally, but certainly not least, Winnie Byanyima, the Executive Director of UNAIDS and Undersecretary General of the United Nations. So please give them a round of applause for being here. And we will try very hard to make this an actual roundtable. So the plan from here is that I've given each of our panelists a question, and which is always dangerous to do because maybe that means they'll spend too much time in making speeches. But I think this is actually quite a robust panel of people. And so what we're going to ask them to do is to respond to the questions that I'll ask them, but also open for all of you here to think on what questions you have. And the fair warning is that I will probably ask you all follow-up questions, and feel free to talk to each other. So if you want to come in, just let me know if you want to do so. So we're going to start with Winnie. And so Winnie, the core question that we've got for you is that, the world, it seems, and I'll just say this, seems to me perhaps, often talks about pandemics over here and AIDS over there. It talks about gender inequality here, and it talks about access to medicines over here. This council is trying to say that these things are linked, that there's something about inequality that's driving pandemics and there's a cycle there. But can you tell us more about that? Can you try to give us a sense of what it is that we're trying to talk about here? Over to you.
Thank you, Matt. And I'm so delighted to be on this panel. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'm delighted to be on this panel, and I'm so proud to be associated with the Global Council and the work that it's doing. It's so important. It's true what you said. Today, there's a discussion going on about pandemic preparedness, prevention, and we have to struggle to inject ourselves in, yet we are the people who have fought a pandemic for so longest time in the world. But the world seems so determined not to learn from what it's done and what it has done well. So pandemics, whether it is HIV, the AIDS pandemic, or COVID, or Mpox, name it, are all driven by inequalities. They start as outbreaks, health outbreaks, but they grow into huge pandemics. They become global because there are inequalities that are like their pathway towards spreading. So whether it's income inequality, gender inequalities, racial inequality, inequality because of your sexuality, your sexual orientation, or sexual identity, all these inequalities are what drive and ignite and not ignite, drive pandemics. So there's no scenario in which we can ever end AIDS without doing what's needed to prepare for future pandemics. Everything we're doing to fight AIDS is about building preparedness for the next one. You would think it's common sense, but it doesn't. It doesn't seem to move into the places where decisions are being made. But we've learned a lot. Imagine a young woman who lives in an informal settlement in a big African city. Why can't she protect herself? Why is it that that is the category that is most at risk of new infections? In a city where there are such high, one of the highest inequalities in the world, a woman like that struggles to get by. She's surrounded by power, but she has none. What are her choices? To feed her children, her choice is to have unsafe transactional sex. That is almost her only option, unsafe transactional sex to feed her children. To get health care, she faces sometimes gender, but also sometimes ethnic discrimination. When a a pandemic like COVID hits, she's a trader in the market. She cannot work from home. She needs to go to the market, but she can't go to the market. She doesn't have money or food that's given to her. The choice is to go out and look for food at the risk of an infection. So many women in Africa were saying at the height of COVID that, you know what, it's better for me to die going to look for food for my children than to sit here trying to be safe from an invisible virus. They were risking their lives. So you could do it differently. You could have social protection that reaches a woman like her, that would put money in her pocket. Then she could have a better choice. You could fund community-led organizations that know how to reach everyone in the neighborhood and get services to people. You could do things differently. But think of it at another level. This young woman I'm talking about lives in the global south. In the global south, what choice does her government have? And I'm looking at Minister Sylvia from Zambia, who is a Minister of Health. What choice does this young woman's government have to finance her health, to finance her needs, her social protection needs? No, not much. So you see that where she's located in the global south, the fact that she's a woman, the fact that she is poor limits all her choices. In the context of a pandemic, she's the one highest at risk. Kenya, I'm giving it as an example. The woman I'm thinking about is a woman I met in Kenya, spent 53% of its revenue on servicing its debt. That was 9 times higher than its health spending, 9 times higher. Pandemic response could help by ensuring that there is ready financing available to fight in pandemic, that when a pandemic kicks in, that there's an emergency financing mechanism where countries can go and quickly get the resources they need to fight. But now I was told yesterday that we have $2 billion in the pandemics fund. Thank you very much, 2 billion. And that there might be 6 billion in 3 years for the global fund, when actually African countries paid 79 billion in 2021 just to service their debt. They were paying out of their pocket 79 billion, service their debt, and a pandemics fund to help them has 2 billion and might have 2 billion. So we see that the initiatives to close the inequalities in financing are too small and meaningless, really. Meaningless. The inequality in financing will continue to be a driver of pandemics if it's not addressed. So I want to leave it there. Matt, I could say more about inequalities and how they drive pandemics, but we shouldn't run away from that fact and think we can, keep doing the same things that we have been doing and then be ready for the next pandemic or end the ones that we are in. Thank you.
Thanks, Winnie. We'll come back to you, I'm sure. So, Professor Stieglitz, I want to turn to you next. And my question to you is, you have said that the international order is simply not fit for purpose when it comes to moments of emergency, including pandemics. That when it comes to that deep inequality in access to financing, but also access to technologies, that fundamentally we need to reorder the international order. And sometimes that, I think, especially to global health audiences, feels just massively overwhelming. Like, how could we possibly have that happen? So can you give us a bit of concrete sense of what is it that you are saying really could happen?
So thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure to be here. Is it working? Yeah. The let me put a little bit of context on SDG 10. I was one of the people who thought it was really important for there to be some focus on inequality. As we were talking about before, it is the source of a lot of other problems in the SDGs. If we don't solve that, we won't attain the other SDGs. And it's a source of concern in its own right, associated with poverty and so forth, and inequalities in health. But remarkably, there was amazing resistance to having a SDG on inequality. And it's interesting where that was coming from. I was fighting it from the US and UK. And you might say, why? President Obama was the president. He gave wonderful speeches about inequality within the United States, but he opposed, or not, I don't know if he knew what was going on in his own State Department. So I don't want to say he opposed, but there was opposition to from the United States to SDG, having an inequality SDG. And I think the reason, there were a couple of reasons. One of them was the US would do very poorly, and the US did not want to be exposed as one of the countries with, in fact, the advanced country with the highest level of inequality. And one of the striking things about the SDGs was it went from the Millennium Development Goals that applied only to developing countries. The SDGs were for all countries. And the idea that US would be, of all the advanced countries, performing the most poorly was a concern. But it was really, they were thinking about income inequality. If they had looked at health inequalities, they would have been even more disturbed, because US levels of health inequalities are so much greater than those of other advanced countries. There's a statistic that I just found in data that came out about it a year ago that is very disturbing, that if you look at the average life expectancy of an indigenous American, a Native American, it is lower than the life expectancy in any country in the Western Hemisphere other than Haiti. And, you know, we're a rich country, and yet because of the inequalities in our society, you get outcomes that are that bad. So when you think about that, what is the underlying going on? If you ask most Americans, they would say inequality is an important issue. Even Republicans talk about a rigged economy. So there is widespread agreement about this. And then you have to ask, what is going on? And it's another dimension of inequality, which is inequality of political power, which itself is related to inequality in economics. And the reason why I want to emphasize this is because on the particular issue that we're talking about today, pandemics, the inequalities in political power really stand out. It was not it was in the interest of everybody in the world, including all Americans, that the pandemic be brought under control as quickly as possible. As long as it raged in some place in the world, there were going to be new mutations that could come back and bite us. So we had a self-interest as a nation in having the pandemic control. But that's not where the political power was. And a number of us campaigned very heavily and got President Biden to support a waiver for the vaccines. It was probably done in a half-hearted way, but Germany and Switzerland and UK opposed it. Not because I think the German people I talked to in Germany supported it, but it was because the drug companies, It was the power of the drug companies over the rest of society. And these are small companies relative to our GDP, relative to everything else. And when it came to the therapeutics, we talked about a little bit earlier in the case of HIV/AIDS, but in the case of COVID-19, there were therapeutics and tests. Even Biden couldn't be moved. And the US opposed a waiver for therapeutics and tests. And then, as I say, as we started, the South African revelations about the nature of the contracts have been really startling, that they were charging South Africa more than they were. One of the arguments that against the vaccine waiver was that the developing countries couldn't produce the vaccines. But then it turns out that South Africa did produce the vaccine, and the contract said it couldn't consume, it had to export 80% or something like that of the vaccines. They couldn't enjoy the benefits of the vaccines that they were producing. All these in secret contracts. And I can tell you the same, there were other things when it was not only Novartis that was, the ones that were in South Africa, in other countries, Pfizer approached government, one of the governments I know, and said, we will only sell you the vaccine if you waive your procurement laws about transparency. And the country said, we'd rather get the vaccines from Russia, even if they're inferior, than to violate our procurement laws. Now, what's so strange about this is the US and maybe other countries are engaged in trying to win the hearts and minds of countries all over the world. And yet this small group of drug companies are doing everything they can to alienate everybody everywhere in the world. And that's all a demonstration of the inequality in political power. But that then comes to the issue, another dimension of inequality that's been already raised is inequalities of fiscal power, inequalities in fiscal space across countries. We've talked about within countries. When a pandemic hits, some countries have more fiscal space to respond. And there's among health people, you think about the ability to provide vaccines, therapeutics. But I want to emphasize another aspect that was very clear in this pandemic, the ability to take actions to support the economy. Because without those actions, the people who don't who go to work, or the people who do go to work, but nobody else is buying because of the vaccine, go without food. And so you get a second round of deaths, not only from the disease itself, but from the economic deprivation. So the United States and other advanced countries spent on average something like 25% of their GDP to support their economy. And in developing countries and emerging markets, the number was less than 10% of that. So their downturns were deeper. Some of the countries had a 10% reduction in GDP. And that lack of fiscal space really has harmful effects, not only directly, but indirectly on the well-being of individuals.
So let's try to come back to this in just a moment. Thank you, Professor Stieglitz. I want to turn to you, Secretary Maciel, and ask if you might tell us kind of two things, right? So one, I'm curious if you have reactions to both what Winnie and Joe were having to say here, because I know that that's core to your work. So I'm curious about that. And then the bigger question is, you know, the Lula government, you all have come in after a moment of challenge, and you are trying very hard to put inequality at the center of all of your policies. And I'm really curious from a national perspective, what do you see in the global space that we're not calling pandemic preparedness, that should be one of the things that actually might reduce inequality and actually help us to be pandemic prepared? And given especially Brazil's experience in COVID, but also in HIV, this has been, and TB, frankly, you've seen so clearly how this inequality works. So what do you all see that's missing from the conversation on pandemic preparedness?
Wow. First of all, I would like to thank you. The honor to be here, Winnie, and apologize my English because I'm not non-native speaking English, so have some trouble to express myself. It's not as good as your professor, but I will try. So first, it was 4 years in Brazil of a mess in the dealing with the pandemic and all this geopolitics and everything. Even with our border, we have no international diplomacy with the border. So this was terrible for our side, because we have another country with economic crisis such as Venezuela, and we have each day around 500 migrants entering our country. So this is make a lot of challenge for the health system, because they are not preparing for this. And this is one subject that we as Brazilian, we don't know how to deal. We didn't have experience in migrants, in health policy. We don't have health policy for them. So now with this 7 months of the new government of President Lula and Minister Anísia, that is leading this agenda, fighting against poverty and inequality. And you'll be very, how do you say, challenged with the destruction that we found when we start this new government. And after pandemic, a lot of things change. But maybe if I can answer your second question, what is missing? And I agree with what Winnie said and the professor too. But I think we learn so few about our connectivity in the world, and we didn't realize if one person in a far from a city that I never heard about, called Wuhan, could change our lives completely and change someone's life forever, because they are not with us anymore. So if one person lives in an environment that there's no sanitary actions in a healthy environment, this can impact my life. So after all these things that we face together, we didn't understand this very important message that we are connected and we depend each other. And if you are not safe, I'm not safe. So we need to understand this. And in this new government, we are trying to focus more in our local production, because we saw during the pandemic the importance of this. Brazil was the first country that gave the HIV medicine free of charge in the world. And I remember because I was a EP student when I saw one minister in Brazil, Ministro Serra, that was to the word, how do you say in English? He was fight against the pharmaceutical industry in the HIV and say that he will broken the intellectual property if the price don't going down. So this was the first fight that you face. And because of that, we have the time and the opportunity to negotiate. And then we have all the generic medicines and a new era for the HIV AIDS patient. Patient was start in Brazil. And right now, I think this will be a very important barrier if you don't talk the intellectual property for the importance for our medicines and the vaccines that we will be producing in the future. I came today with WHO, Dr. Tedros launched the vaccine accelerator for TB. And it's very important when we sit with the founders agency that we discussing price, affordable price, access for this, because we saw in this pandemic, if we don't have the access, we have this mutation and everything start again. And even now, you don't have equal access for this COVID-19 vaccine. So it's a crazy world and we didn't learn nothing. So I think it's very important to be prepared. And we are right now in the United Nations discussing about preparedness for the next pandemic, but we are not prepared now. We are not preparing now because we don't have transparency between us. We don't have trust between us. So I think we are much more suspicious after pandemic than we were before, and no country wants to be the index case. So this will be I think it will be a very important challenge for us to build this trust that we can share our data in a equal basis. And if you share like sample, we need to share intellectual property. So I think this will be the most important to have access for all. And thank you.
No, thank you. So building on that, I want to turn to you, Ms. Guanas, and ask you to tell us a little bit about. You've heard both Winnie and Joe touch on financing questions, and as vice chair of the Global Fund, but also as many hats that you have had in your career, and you have a big bird's eye view on many of these issues. What do you see as the way that global health financing needs to, and frankly, concretely can transform itself to respond to this era, especially where we see this intersection of pandemics and inequality? What do you think are the keys there, and how do we get there?
Thank you very much. I think I want to pick up from where you stopped and to say that pandemics are not what we should look for in terms of a future response. It's already what we have experienced as we are sitting now. And we know what we have experienced is that we have got resource-rich countries, but poor people. And the people that are obviously the hardest hit by pandemics are who? Are the poor people. So you constantly get into this cycle of poor people being hit by pandemics becoming poorer, becoming vulnerable, and becoming marginalized. And that's when we start looking for bandages. People don't need bandages anymore. I think that is where we sometimes fail to address the real issues. I'm glad, Prof, you have said that when we talk about the SDGs, that was very important to bring in the element of inequality, that we look at the other SDGs through the inequality lens. Because I think that's where we failed with the MDGs. But with the SDGs, what it means, therefore, is that you cannot look at the SDGs in silos, because we are talking about structural inequalities that arises from the economics, from the finance, from social and environment. So all I'm trying to say is that when we speak about inequalities, we're sitting here and saying we are waiting for another pandemic to happen. It has happened as we sit right now. What have we done in response to what has happened in the past? Now, I also hear a lot about community resilience, and I sometimes want to ask, what exactly does it mean? Does community resilience mean bringing communities to the table? Involving them in the decision-making as far as, many other issues that impact their lives are concerned. But today that word does not have meaning, because when you hear country ownership and community resilience, they have become words that are not applied in practice. And so if we look from the perspective of, finances, where is it that we are going to put our investments? I think for me, the most important thing from the days that I worked with was the fragmentation of our interventions. I mean, we are competing for resources. Resources are scarce. And yet we keep on setting up new institutions, new infrastructure, new this, new that. I think it's also about how do we streamline, how do we harmonize and coordinate. And, I think of the Paris principles. Do we still remember them? Do we still remember the Paris principles? I think we have forgotten somewhere. Somewhere down the line, we have forgotten, because already then, it was about aid effectiveness and how to streamline that in order to better the lives of people. But we need to come back to your point earlier. We talk about debt and about whatever it is. Where are the resources of the countries that have resources? Where is it going? Is it going into building infrastructure inside the countries? Where are the resources going? Diamonds, uranium, name it. Where is it going? So we need to address the issue of decolonization. Let's not hide around the bush. This is where the crux of the matter is. If we have not learned a lesson from COVID, and how we handle COVID, and we are trying to sugarcoat what has happened, we are not going to be prepared for the next pandemic. So interventions, yes, it has to be at different fronts, as I said. To just handle it as a silo, it will not work. It is going to require us to ask deeper questions and be very honest and frank and build the trust. I think earlier, I remember Helen was saying, you can't build trust during a crisis. And we had many crises before, and we have failed the people. And people do not therefore trust that we will be able to prevent or to respond to a future pandemic.
That's a hard act to follow. This core question of kind of trust and of systems and how do we build them and how do we create ownership, I think is something let's come back to in just a moment. I have one final question for you, Dr. Salaman, and that is to talk to us a little bit about, so far you've heard conversations about financing, we've heard some deep conversations about kind of structures that are or are not enabling pieces. And one of the ideas of this council is that, in fact, we have been through and are still going through the AIDS pandemic. And in that 25 years, we have in fact learned a lot of things, and some of which we've not applied faithfully across the world. And that explains why some countries are just seeing real success against AIDS and some are struggling. But also, we certainly haven't applied a bunch of what we know from the AIDS response to COVID-19. And there seems to be big resistance. So the question that I've got for you is, part of what WHO has been working on so deeply has been this: how do we get the newest technologies for HIV that are coming right now? How do we make sure that we get them to the people who need them most? And what's standing in the way of us using those kinds of mechanisms to get what we need to people in other contexts?
Thank you so much for your question. And first of all, I would like to say that this is a historic week because we have 3 high-level meetings, one on PPPR, and I've just heard that the PPPR political declaration has been adopted. That's a very good point. Second, tomorrow will be on UHC, and the importance of UHC, PHC, to be sure that all the most vulnerable have access to health. And the last one, and it's not, of course, the least, TB, and the link between TB and HIV and the burden of co-infections. So it's a very historic moment. Second point, we are all together without any mask. So COVID is not anymore a public health emergency of international concern. That's a good point. But we have to be aware that the virus is still there, and we are not in a post-pandemic era, but in a pre-pandemic era, which is something very different. We have to be prepared. So who are the victims of all these pandemics? The victims are always the most vulnerable, always. The unreached, the marginalized populations, the poorest. So what could we learn about AIDS response? And this is a very specific year, 23, because we are 40 years after the virus discovery. And we are 40 years after, this meeting in Denver of activists in 83. And they took a historic first step towards the global principle of greater involvement of people with HIV. And now we always involve persons with, lived experience. I think it's really very important. Of course, people with experience, but also young people. So we learned a lot about the importance and the meaningful engagement of affected communities. And I think now we always work with affected communities, and we have this GPA principle, the GIPA principle, which promotes the participation of people, and it's very important in decision making. And of course, WHO continues to actively support this principle, involving always civil society, NGOs, persons with lived experience, and young people, because young people are very, very important, creative, and they are the next generation. So we always have to involve young people, and this is very important in CDs, it's very important in NCDs, and we don't have to forget mental health, because mental health is everywhere. So we have to be aware that there is no health without mental health, there is no health without sexual health, and we need to have this integrated approach. So all what we learned was demonstrated in the Ebola and Mpox outbreak management. And the strong reaction, the strong mobilization of the communities during Mpox is very important. You know that having a right-based public health approach is so important for all actors in health. And you know that this year, WHO is celebrating its 75th anniversary. So we continue to work closely with scientists, with communities, because the most important problem is to be sure that we ensure optimal access to affordably priced essential commodities. So working on PHC means it's not only PHC or UHC principles, it's what is the list of essential services, essential drugs that everyone should have access to. So just to raise the point that we have new medicines now for many, many diseases, and this treatment could have a very large public health impact only if they are affordable, effective, and that we have access to this treatment everywhere for all people. So what we learned during HIV, what we learned recently due to COVID, is that we should avoid to replicate and to duplicate the mistakes we did a few years ago. And so we need really to tackle all health challenges. We need also to have dedicated and robust and well-financed disease-specific response. Having an integrated approach, just an example about HIV, when someone comes for HIV test, of course, he deserves test and treatment. We should also have all STI diagnosis and all hepatitis and viral hepatitis diagnosis, because it's not only test and treat, it should be vaccinate, test and treat.
Thank you. So we're going to open it to the room. So someone's got some microphone somewhere. So Mahesh has got some microphones. I'm going to ask one question of the panelists before, and as you all are thinking about kind of what you want to know. And my question is just this: does anybody want to volunteer things? We're here in New York, where fundamentally, what's supposed to happen out of the United Nations today is a new declaration about how we will approach pandemics going forward that will reinvent our way of doing things. Now, we're really glad that the pandemics, the pandemics declaration has been not approved but agreed in the room, and then it goes from here back to the UNGA. But what do you want to name something that you feel like is missing from the work that's been done here that really would get it? Is there anything specific that you would say if you were writing this piece and it was just you and you didn't have to negotiate with 193 other countries? What do you feel like is missing that has to be front and center that you would like kind of concretely for the world to be committing to that they haven't so far? Anybody who would like to give a quick answer, go for it, Joe.
Well, it's obvious that in terms of pandemic preparedness, there have to be production facilities in the developing countries, because we know that when the pandemic occurs, countries, including countries who say they believe in rules-based trade, will ignore the rules and protect their citizens first. So if you don't have the production in your country, you aren't protected. And the second thing is, it's unconscionable, as I think we all think, that there isn't a sharing of intellectual property rights. And in the case of COVID-19, it was particularly unconscionable because the people, most of the money was paid publicly, and the profits were appropriated by a couple companies. So, that was inequality increasing in so many dimensions. Poor people who were poor wound up getting sicker in the hospital, and a few owners of Pfizer stock and the CEO got richer. So it was a double way of increasing inequality. So, and from what I've, the drafts that have been sent around don't adequately deal with either the distribution of production or the access to intellectual property. As I said, I think it's just unconscionable that anybody would be talking a pandemic accord that doesn't have those two provisions.
Others that would like to come in? Go for it.
Totally agree with you, Joe. Local production in every region is critical if we are to prevent future pandemics. So too is the sharing of technology, even though we are hearing all kinds of minimal solutions to that coming into the document, but we need to address it head on. We have a model that's worked for HIV, where companies are persuaded to share their technology, that generics are made and then prices are affordable. But then even that, while it has worked and we have 30 million people on treatment, we have situations where some countries struggle to get the best treatment for their people, particularly middle-income countries. But so we need to solve that. But I would like to add to that list. And when I've said this, I've found that both delegations from rich countries and delegations from developing countries look like this is not what this document is about. Whenever I say that that treaty must put communities at the center and spell out that communities will lead when pandemics hit, it's like this is about law, rules and regulations and money, but not about people, literally, because I don't get an enthusiastic, yes, we must spell it out. No, but it should be there. Otherwise, again, we will have a situation where governments want to lead. Governments are rolling out public health rules, directives that drive communities away from getting up to help themselves. We saw this in COVID, where people were empowered, had been working on HIV, had been leading. Now, some governments were saying, everybody stay indoors and we're going to help you. They were not saying communities come forward and find the solution for yourselves. So we need to spell out how communities will lead. Communities deliver services, communities do prevention campaigning, communities monitor and see how services are being delivered and speak and say how they want to be served. Without that, pandemic preparedness treaty will not have, will have missed a very important piece for the success.
Anyone else that would like to add something before I open to the room?
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question?
You may.
One of the problems, another problem that was exposed in response to COVID-19 was the rash of mis and disinformation. And is there some way of thinking about how we ought to be prepared for another episode of mis and disinformation? I don't have the answer, but maybe I'd like.
I think I could. It's not working. I can add an example from Brazil right now that we are facing. We have a new law that tried to regulate the big techs in Brazil, because the misinformation was very important to spread the pandemic in Brazil. And in the day, 2 days before the law was going to the parliament to vote, the big techs make a massive movement in the media, and they put the law down. So think about this. We have a country that was completely captured for the big tech. So I think this is very important. It's a very important point to us, because the way that we are connected right now, the way that we take our decisions, it's very much influenced by two or three people in the world. It's unbelievable. And I'd like to add another thing, what Winnie was just saying. I think I was thinking a lot about this day in New York with all this declaration and everything. And maybe we have to rethink the way that we are doing the declaration, because the process is the most part is doing by the diplomats, and the diplomats, they don't know the reality. Even in poor country, they live in a completely different environment. They don't know what was happening in the health service in a small city in the countryside of Brazil or South Africa or whatever. So, and this is the person that are in a closed room discussing about what the world will be doing. So, and we are what we are discussing right now. The declaration does not feel what we need to them to show us, because there is not people that are working with this. The most part are diplomat that we are work together, but it's a completely different world, the completely different environment. They don't know the basics of the health service and all these other things that we are discussing. So I was thinking a lot about this in this week here, and seeing what was going on and thinking what we are giving for the next generation, what we are, all of us are doing here, repeating the same thing that the old generation did. So this is one open question, but but I think we want to have like different things, repeat always the same that we are doing for the 40 years. So it should be the same results, and we are repeating.
I see Winnie wanting to come in, and then I really am gonna open it up to the room. Okay, let's open it up to the room. Go ahead. We've got a few, and then
Hi.
sure, you'll work it in.
Hi, my name is Sharon Ann Lynch from the O'Neill Institute. Hey Winnie, I just wanted to pick up on the conversation regarding local production, regional production, which, you know, at all the side events with all the potato chips, there's talk of, but they refer to the low-hanging fruit, right? The rapid diagnostic tests, the simple treatment, and great, good, but more. So we don't need just malaria treatment. We should be making plans to make sure that there's manufacturing of the monoclonal antibodies for malaria prevention. We know that monoclonal antibodies, MABs, will figure highly as part of any therapeutic response, medical countermeasure to the next pandemic, I think. And Brazil is again in a wonderful position with Fiocruz, because essentially we are in a 1999 moment. It was in this building in 2001 that Brazil announced that it was going to be working on local production of ARVs. But before that, Brazil came out with the cost of goods for ARVs and gave the blueprint. And I say it's like 1999 again for ARVs for MABs as it was for ARVs then, because there's the same percentage of that all of Africa represents in terms of the MABs market today. That was the ARVs market in 1999. So less than 2% of monoclonal antibodies used for prevention, used for treatment, are in Africa. Under 2%. Whereas Brazil can lead the way, partner with India to lead the way. I know I'm hitting on old themes, but we cannot rely any longer on the multilateral mechanisms to save the day. It's going to take the countries as part of upending that world order. So we look to you, Vice Minister, to do that. Thank you.
Let's take a few more, and we'll try to keep in our minds those pieces. And so coming back to you, I don't know, Mahesh is in charge.
I'll go there and I'll come back.
Great. 1, 2.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Stefano Todde from the Dominican Republic. during the negotiation of these political declarations, sorry, I'm on camera. Okay. Hi, Mom. So during the negotiation of the pandemic declaration, a lot of countries try to put a paragraph about how new free trade agreement are pursuing stronger EPR, and how the inclusion of pharmaceutical company in the settlement, in the dispute settlement agreement, is a way to create to break the balance between the public sector, the private sector, and the community. How we can address the problem of stronger EPR, new free trade agreements, and access to new medicine, new device, when even a small sound of a device now can be patented for 20 years. So how we address the elephant in the room?
Thank you. We'll take one more. I think Mandeep to start, and then we'll take two more. Please.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Mandeep Dhaliwal from UNDP, and it's brilliant. I think this is one of the best conversations I've heard in the last couple of days. I wanted to come back to the intellectual property question. India did not patent medicines, therapeutics or vaccines from 1947, from its independence, until 2003. And because of that ecosystem, they were able to build one of the world's largest and most powerful generics industry, which supplied pharmaceuticals, including AIDS medicines, to the world. That's brilliant. 2003, heavy lobby from pharmaceutical companies, and India passed a law saying that we will patent medicines. So I think it's not just sharing the IP. I don't think medicines should be patented. I don't think medicines, diagnostics, and therapeutics should be commodities. They are life-saving tools, and they belong to everyone. In order to do that, I think you have to build capacity not just for manufacturing. You need to build capacity for science, research and development, as well as the manufacturing across all regions. There's brilliant scientists in Africa, in India, in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, in South Africa, in South America. So, what is preventing the investment in that science for that to be unleashed and for there to be then the local production? So I think we need a real rethink, and I'm challenging the council here to think, don't think in the same paradigms we have right now. And then I want to say one more thing. Helen mentioned LGBTQI+ people. And I think if you look at who was the worst off, it's men who have sex with men, gay men, transgender people, sex workers, people who use drugs, and then the intersection of all of those behaviors. So I care deeply about women and children, but I think we need to be very explicit in naming these other populations who are now suffering some of the fastest growing infections. So I hope that the council will also be quite explicit about that. Final point on financing. I went to a session this morning on UHC and sustainable financing, and it's mind-boggling that all of a sudden now the donors are saying, countries, you must spend more money on health. The largest increase in health financing will come from domestic budgets. How are the 60 countries who are in debt distress going to do that? I don't understand. How, it takes a year, 2 years to restructure debt. Zambia's just done it. It's very difficult. Chad has just done it. It's incredibly difficult. How are they going to come up with more money? Yet we give $7 trillion a year in fossil fuel subsidies. It just does not add up. So I'll stop there, but it'd be great to hear the panels.
And Minister, please.
Thank you. I thought I should not leave without saying something. Thank you for the invitation, though I was invited for a picture. I've gone beyond the picture. I just wanted to stay to basically emphasize that my president of the Republic of Zambia, Mr. Hakainde Hichilema, attaches great importance to this SDG 10. And that's why I had to stay here. But of course, as a female minister, I myself, I believe in this. So this is what I want to say. First of all, thank you for this important meeting. And thank you for the Global Council. And thank you for keeping this issue on the agenda. And I just want to underscore and agree with you that really this DG 10 is as important as the DG on women equality. And if these two can be taken together, I'm sure myself that the rest of the SDGs will be met. It's sad that when we are halfway to the end of the term for SDGs, we've only reached 15%. Of course, we have good excuses as to why that is so. The issue of global climate effects, the issue of, what about the issue of wars, which are avoidable, and the issues of inequalities, which also are avoidable. I'm sure if we work together, we can achieve something for our nation. So I just wanted to say thank you, and also to underscore that His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Zambia, this is part of his passion. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
I have to go back to the conference.
So I think, oh, okay, one more, Moga, go, quick. We just have 10 minutes.
Okay, Monge Kamaliani. I'm just to say that a couple of things. One, that pandemics don't start as pandemics. Clearly, they start as a small outbreak. Now, there's 100 outbreaks in Africa every year, according to WHO. But these are diseases that we consider them neglected diseases. So we rely on, I don't know, charitable work or some other forms to invest in these diseases. I totally, utterly agree with Mandy. What we're looking for is R&D hubs in our countries in the South, so that our scientists don't have to migrate to the North in order to actually do their work in a lab. So we need our governments, it's not just the money, but we need our governments in the South to prioritize investing in healthcare and investing in medical research, which means investing in tertiary education, which was like, oh, if we don't invest in tertiary education, the World Bank used for decades to advise not to invest in tertiary education because it is for the elite. I'm not in the elite. I come from a poor family, and I mean poor, but I'm here because my country invested in tertiary education. So I think we need to invest in medical research and also technology transfer. I mean, we have the chance. Countries, all governments have the chance in the pandemic treaty negotiation, the IHR review, in order to make commitments. The declaration of Vanga does not make commitment. Governments are not committed. They should be all committed to push technology transfer, sharing collaborative research, and removing IP barrier and investing in long-term production. Otherwise, we'll repeat the same thing. We need transformation, not things as they are.
Thanks. All right, so you have easy tasks, panelists, which is just to respond to the question of how do we get MABs to the world, and how do we ensure that we don't just plan for the easy things to be produced in the South, but we plan for the big things. What do we do about free trade agreements and increasing IPR issues around FTAs? What do we do about capacity for science, right? How do we remove patents overall? What about debt distress? And I do want to make sure that we touch on this, that there's a big conversation here going on that really, there's this huge disconnect where there's a conversation about we're going to raise lots more money from domestic resources. That's the way we're going to reach sustainability, while others are talking about massive debt. So what are the concrete solutions here? What do we do? And then SDG 10, and then a whole bunch of really important points about R&D. So with that, I'm going to turn it to you all and see if you want to pick one, maybe two, to answer as you go, and I'll run down the line. So can I start with you, Joe?
Okay, I guess very briefly, you know, the UN adopted a set of principles in 2015 for restructuring debt. And it was overwhelmingly, it was only 6 countries that voted against it. But they happen to be the important countries like the United States and UK. And that means there isn't a framework for debt restructuring. And that's the reality that we have. And it's going to be a very painful process, which is going to affect every one of the SDGs, every one of the social concerns we have. That's where we are. But I hope it's not going to be able, the process is slow enough that we're not going to be able to resolve this debt crisis, but we have debt crises over and over again. So I hope that this provides momentum to really adopt, to revive those principles that we adopted in 2015 and get a framework that works. On, let me say, on intellectual property, I have to feel, as an economist, the drug companies, obviously it's in their self-interest to say that you have to have very strong IPRs in order to, intellectual property, in order to innovate. And that's wrong. But I don't think we should go to the other extreme and not have any intellectual property. I think the framework that was adopted of compulsory licenses was the right way of thinking about it. But the problem was the drug companies figured out how to drag their feet and make sure nothing happens. And that's why in the presence of a waiver, the presence of a pandemic, we have to have a blanket waiver. You can't go product by product through the use of compulsory licensing. So that's why the waiver is the right approach. I think we have to recognize that the drug companies have exaggerated the importance of intellectual property. We had an interesting controlled experiment because the United States, the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot have patents on naturally occurring genes. And there was a patent on the 2 genes related to BRCA, the BRCA genes that related to breast cancer. And when they overnight eliminated those patents, the prices came down and innovation went up. So it's sort of a controlled experiment where eliminating intellectual property actually clearly led to more innovation. And there's some other controlled experiments that have occurred. Prize systems, Bernie Sanders has advocated a prize system, and there was a discussion at WHO for a prize system, much better. NIH, most of the basic research goes on in government labs and universities. So the real question is, how do we restore some balance that we can have some intellectual property, but recognize that these other ways of producing knowledge are very effective. And and what's really important, obviously, is that knowledge not only gets produced, but it gets used. And IPR represents an impediment to the use of knowledge.
That seems like a mic drop moment. And an important one for us to look at. And as we think about the Global Council, as we think about opportunities to put this into action, I think it's going to be a central piece of our charge. May I turn to you, Secretary Maciel? And I think a couple of questions came your way, including things about like really advancing these questions of R&D from the South and creating those kinds of hubs, and really creating an opportunity for production of high-end advanced technologies rather than playing catch up. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on those or any of the others.
Oh, I think we are always talking to each other, to people that are convincing with our flags, what we believe. And I realized I'm a full professor of epidemiology at one federal university in Brazil. And I never think in my life that I was being a political, in a political position. But I realized that in our Congress in Brazil, we have a lot of people that defend Bible, that defend agriculture, because it's very strong in Brazil, and people that defend army, they are very strong. So, but we are not very strong in defending research and development and other things that we here think it's very important. So I think we need to occupy this space. We need to move on for this comfort zone that we are always in, talking in academic way, in the groups that we are talking, and go to the political space, because unfortunately or fortunately is there that all this law and declaration is doing. So if you are not there, someone will, and they will do this for us. So this is the one thing that I learned in this very 4 years, very with a very hard way in this past government in Brazil, that we are persecution. We have like we have our life threatened. So a lot of strange things that happen in Brazil. But now with all this new government and with the people that are much more technical, came from the research field, we were able to convince the government what we need to invest in terms of research and development in the health science in Brazil. So let's see the next step, but I think we need to change the way where we are right now. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll excuse Professor Stieglitz, who needs to run to his next engagement. And I'll just ask our last panelists to be brief, because I think we're supposed to have been kicked out of the room a few minutes ago, and I apologize that I've kept us a little long. But if you've got some please closing thoughts on these big questions, and then hopefully folks can stick around for a little while and we won't be kicked out. Over to you.
I've always said the world recognized that Africa has got the highest disease burden. And yet it's the same world that does not recognize that Africa should have the capacity to deal with its highest disease burden. And so sometimes I have a feeling that it is like holding countries with high disease burdens hostage to profits, rather than what one would always talk about, the public good. We cannot, I mean, you have got Bill of Rights in countries, let me talk about the continent, that speaks about the right to health. How can you exercise the right to health if you cannot provide your people with access to health and, that can deal with the issues that we are talking about? So basically, as somebody was saying, we always try and avoid the elephant in the room because we want to be nice. We want to be very diplomatic about issues. But I think for many that had gone through struggles in their life, you know that it does not come on a silver plate. You have to fight for it. But I think we are in a much better position than we would have been before. And I think it's up to the governments, especially in the global south, to start really getting to the negotiating table, not from a position of weakness, but from a position of strength as well. Because that's always where I feel that maybe we are losing out on opportunities where we could make the difference and bring that manufacturing capacity to the global south, because it's only, and I can say it without fear or favor, it is only when we in the global south will be able to meet the needs of our communities that we will be able to have pandemic preparedness and response. Without that, we will sit with another COVID. So the imbalance in terms of providing the public good is where I think we have a problem. That's the elephant in the room that needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Dr. Solomon.
Thank you. Thank you for insisting on the explicit list of key populations. We already do that, and of course it's crucial. And thank you for highlighting the importance of NTDs, because in the NTDs, in the neglected tropical disease, we have emerging diseases and maybe outbreaks and future pandemics. So we need more science, more research, more education, more innovation. And then we have to move as quickly as possible to give access to everyone. So it's not only a problem of prices, because sometimes if you think about hypertension, the drugs are really not expensive, but a lot of people don't have any access to these drugs. So at WHO, we are trying to speed up the process. We are writing guidelines, and we are trying to fight for lower and accessible pricing. So our really main objective is to do as soon as possible for all countries without any discrimination, because having a delay and fighting delays is very important, because during delays you have new infection, new victims, new deaths. So we can't have this time to fight all together, because the world now is only one village. Thank you.
We need last words.
Thank you so much. I so enjoyed this discussion. For me, it is about closing the inequalities that are delaying us from ending HIV, AIDS as a public health threat, and will also play in when there's the next pandemic. And key among them is access to health technologies. I mean, this system where when there's something new, it's going to take 10 years before it reaches the people who need it, is inefficient and costs lives. We must find a way where the best science reaches those who need it immediately. And we are not yet there. And we are talking around this question of sharing technology, but we need a resolution of that. Secondly, access to resources by all countries. The international financial architecture has to be reformed. Mechanisms have to be there to access resources in emergencies. And that access should be for all countries, not for some. So that is an area for me that's critical, and I would want to see progress on. Third is closing the gap on rights, that people in every country, every individual's life should matter. Criminal laws that make some people criminals just because of who they love or who they say they are out of date, should not be there, and we should move faster to remove them. But even that is not enough. We have attitudes in society that make a woman an object, a sex object, that make a girl less important than a boy, son preference. These have to be fought to in order for prevention and also for reducing the risk, but also for accessing services. Thank you so much. Thank you, Matt.
Please join me in thanking our panelists for this conversation. This is the first public conversation from the Global Council on Inequality, AIDS, and Pandemics, which I got right this time, but it is not the last. This is also some of the members of the council who are here in New York, but we're missing, for example, the community leaders from the council. We're missing the colleagues who are working on gender equity, et cetera. And so what you'll see from us across the period is a focus on several different axes of inequality that are driving today's pandemics. And so let me thank all of the people who were listening online online and joined us around the world on YouTube, and those in the room, especially the delegates who are busy negotiating various things. And hopefully you'll take some of these things both from here, but from here back to Geneva, where also the high level conversations around the pandemic accord are happening. So thank you all, and goodbye. Please do a picture.